The Hartwell Grand Hotel stood like a palace in the heart of Chicago, its marble floors polished to perfection, and its crystal chandeliers casting golden light across every corner of the magnificent ballroom that evening. And among the hundreds of wealthy guests dressed in their finest clothes, not a single person noticed the old man pushing a mop bucket near the back wall. His name was Marcus Williams, and he had worked as a janitor at the Hartwell Grand Hotel for 30 long years, arriving before sunrise and leaving long after sunset, cleaning the messes that rich people left behind without ever receiving so much as a thank you or a simple nod of acknowledgement. Marcus was 58 years old now, with gray hair that had turned almost completely white at the temples, deep wrinkles around his tired eyes, and hands so rough and calloused from decades of hard labor that they looked more like leather than skin. And on this particular Friday evening in November, he found himself working during one of the biggest charity galas the hotel had ever hosted. The ballroom was filled with the kind of people Marcus had spent his entire life watching from a distance. Businessmen in expensive tailored suits that probably cost more than his yearly salary, women wearing diamond necklaces and designer dresses that sparkled under the lights, politicians shaking hands and making promises they would never keep, and celebrities who smiled for cameras while pretending to care about whatever cause they were supposedly supporting. Marcus moved through the crowd like a ghost, invisible to everyone around him, and he had learned long ago that this was simply how the world worked for people like him. The rich lived in one world and the poor lived in another, and even when they occupied the same room, they existed in completely different realities that never truly touched. Tonight the gala was raising money for music education in underprivileged schools, which Marcus found somewhat ironic given that most of these wealthy donors had probably never set foot in a public school in their entire lives. But he kept his thoughts to himself as he always did, and continued pushing his mop bucket along the edges of the room. At the center of the ballroom stood a magnificent Steinway grand piano, its black surface gleaming like a mirror under the chandelier lights, and Marcus found himself unable to look away from it. There was something about that piano that called to him, something that stirred memories he had buried so deep inside himself that he had almost forgotten they existed. A famous pianist named Richard Thornton was performing that evening, a man with silver hair and an arrogant smile who had played in concert halls around the world and charged thousands of dollars for private performances, and the guests watched him with admiration as his fingers danced across the keys. Marcus stood frozen in his corner, his mop handle gripped tightly in his weathered hands, as the music washed over him like waves crashing against a shore. The piece was Chopin, and Marcus recognized it immediately even though he had not heard it performed live in over 40 years. Richard Thornton played well enough, technically proficient with all the right notes in all the right places, but there was something missing from his performance that Marcus could not quite name. It was as if the pianist was showing off his skill rather than truly feeling the music, performing for applause rather than playing from the heart, and Marcus felt a strange sadness settle over him as he listened. The piece ended and the crowd erupted into enthusiastic applause, champagne glasses raised in appreciation, and Richard Thornton stood up from the piano bench and took an elaborate bow. He announced that he would be taking a brief intermission before his next set, and the guests immediately returned to their conversations about stock portfolios and vacation homes, and all the other topics that rich people discussed at events like these. Marcus should have continued his work and moved on to the next section of the ballroom that needed cleaning, but instead he found himself rooted to the spot, staring at that beautiful piano sitting empty on the stage. His heart was beating faster now, and his hands had begun to tremble slightly, and somewhere deep inside his chest, he felt something awakening that he had kept locked away for most of his adult life. He remembered hands smaller than his pressing down on piano keys for the first time. He remembered a woman's voice telling him that he had a gift from God and that he must never waste it. He remembered bright lights and thunderous applause, and the feeling of being truly alive in a way that nothing else in his life had ever made him feel. The memories came flooding back like water breaking through a dam, and Marcus felt tears pricking at the corners of his eyes as he stood there clutching his mop handle. What was he doing here, he wondered, cleaning up after people who would never know his name, living a life that was half a life, existing rather than truly living. The piano sat there waiting, its keys gleaming like an invitation, and Marcus felt a pull toward it that was almost physical in its intensity. He knew it was crazy even to think about it. He was a janitor, an old man in a worn blue uniform with scuffed shoes and calloused hands, and the idea of him walking up to that stage and sitting down at that magnificent instrument was absolutely ridiculous. The guests would laugh at him. They would mock him and record him on their phones and turn him into some kind of viral joke. He would probably lose his job, the only thing keeping a roof over his head and food on his table. But as Marcus stood there in his corner, watching the wealthy guests mingle and chat without ever noticing his existence, something inside him shifted. He thought about all the years he had spent being invisible, all the dreams he had abandoned, all the music that had lived inside him with nowhere to go. He thought about his mother and the promises he had made to her before she died, promises he had never been able to keep. And he thought about the fact that he was 58 years old now, and that time was running out for him to ever feel truly alive again. Before he could talk himself out of it, Marcus set down his mop and began walking toward the event coordinator, a sharp-looking woman with perfectly styled blonde hair who was typing something on her phone near the entrance to the ballroom. His legs felt weak and his mouth had gone dry, but he kept walking anyway, one step after another, until he was standing right in front of her. She did not look up from her phone at first, and Marcus had to clear his throat twice before she finally acknowledged his presence with an annoyed glance. "Yes," she said impatiently, her eyes already drifting back to her screen. "What is it?" Marcus opened his mouth to speak, and for a moment no words came out. But then he thought of that piano sitting empty on the stage, and he thought of all the music trapped inside him, and he found his voice at last. "I was wondering," he said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper, "if I might be allowed to play a piece during the intermission." The woman looked up at him again, and this time she really looked at him, taking in his janitor uniform and his gray hair and his rough working hands. Her expression shifted from annoyance to disbelief, to something that might have been amusement. And in that moment, Marcus knew exactly what she saw when she looked at him. She saw a nobody, a nothing, an old janitor who had lost his mind. But he did not look away, and he did not take back his request. He simply stood there and waited for her answer, his heart pounding so hard he was sure she must be able to hear it. The event coordinator's name was Patricia Wexler, and she had been organizing high society galas and charity events in Chicago for over 15 years, working with celebrities and politicians and business leaders who expected everything to be absolutely perfect at all times. In all those years, she had dealt with every kind of unexpected situation imaginable, from celebrity meltdowns to catering disasters to last-minute venue changes. But never in her entire career had she encountered anything quite like this. An old janitor in a stained blue uniform was standing in front of her asking if he could play the piano at one of the most prestigious charity events of the year. Patricia stared at Marcus for a long moment, waiting for him to laugh or admit that he was joking, but the old man simply stood there looking at her with an expression that was somehow both humble and determined. "I'm sorry," she said slowly, as if speaking to a child who did not understand how the world worked, "but did you just ask to play the piano?" "Yes, ma'am," Marcus replied, his voice quiet but steady despite the fear that was making his knees feel weak. "I know how it must sound coming from someone like me, but I promise you I can play." Patricia looked around the ballroom as if searching for a hidden camera, certain that someone must be playing an elaborate prank on her. But there were no cameras and no laughing pranksters waiting to jump out and reveal the joke. This old janitor was completely serious. "Look," she said, trying to keep her voice patient even though she had 1,000 other things to deal with that evening. "I appreciate the offer, but we have a professional pianist for this event, and I really don't think—" "Please," Marcus interrupted, and there was something in his voice that made Patricia pause. "I know I don't look like much, and I know you have no reason to trust me, but I am asking you to give me just a few minutes." Patricia studied the old man standing before her, taking in the deep lines on his face that told stories of a hard life, the calluses on his hands that spoke of years of physical labor, and the strange light in his eyes that seemed almost desperate. She should say no, she knew that without question, because saying yes would be unprofessional and potentially embarrassing for everyone involved. But there was something about this man that gave her pause, something in the way he looked at that piano across the room as if it were an old friend he had not seen in decades. Besides, she thought to herself, the intermission was dragging on longer than expected, and the guests were starting to look bored. If this old janitor wanted to make a fool of himself on stage, perhaps it would at least provide some entertainment for the crowd. "Fine," she said with a dismissive wave of her hand, already reaching for her phone to document what she assumed would be a hilarious disaster. "Go ahead, be my guest." Marcus felt his heart leap in his chest at her words, hardly able to believe that she had actually said yes. "Thank you," he said, and he meant it with every fiber of his being. "Thank you so much." Patricia watched him walk away toward the stage, shaking her head in disbelief at the situation she had just allowed to unfold, and she began typing a quick message to her assistant warning her that things might be about to get very interesting. As Marcus made his way across the ballroom, weaving through clusters of wealthy guests who barely noticed him passing by, he felt as if he were walking in a dream. The piano seemed to grow larger and more magnificent with every step he took toward it, its polished black surface reflecting the light of the chandeliers like stars scattered across a midnight sky. His hands were shaking badly now, and his mouth had gone completely dry, but he forced himself to keep walking, one foot in front of the other, until he reached the edge of the raised platform where the piano waited. The first person to notice what was happening was a young woman in a red dress standing near the front of the crowd. She nudged her husband and pointed at Marcus, and her husband turned to look with an expression of confusion that quickly transformed into amusement. "Is that the janitor?" she whispered, not quite quietly enough, and several people nearby turned to see what she was talking about. Word spread through the crowd like wildfire, and soon dozens of eyes were fixed on the old man in the worn blue uniform, who was climbing the steps to the stage. "What is he doing?" someone asked. "I think he's going to play the piano," someone else answered with a laugh. "You can't be serious. This should be good." The whispers grew louder, and the laughter less restrained as Marcus crossed the stage and approached the beautiful Steinway that had been calling to him all evening. He could feel their eyes on him, could hear their mocking comments, could sense their certainty that he was about to embarrass himself in front of everyone. A group of young executives near the bar were openly laughing now, holding up their phones to record what they expected would be a hilarious viral video of an old janitor failing spectacularly. Richard Thornton, the professional pianist, stood off to the side of the stage with his arms crossed and an amused smirk on his face, shaking his head at the absurdity of what he was witnessing. "This is going to be a disaster," he muttered to a woman standing next to him. "Someone should really stop this before it goes any further." But no one moved to stop Marcus as he reached the piano bench and slowly lowered himself onto its cushioned surface. He sat there for a moment, his weathered hands resting on his knees, staring at the black and white keys stretching out before him like an old familiar road. He had not traveled in a very long time. The ballroom had grown quieter now, the conversations dying down as more and more guests turned their attention to the strange scene unfolding on stage. A child tugged at his mother's sleeve and asked in a voice loud enough for everyone to hear, "Mommy, why is the cleaning man sitting at the piano?" The mother shushed her child but did not answer the question, and nervous laughter rippled through the crowd. Marcus heard every word and felt every stare, and for a brief moment he wanted nothing more than to stand up and walk away and go back to his mop bucket where he belonged. But then he looked down at the piano keys, and he remembered the first time he had ever sat at a piano as a small boy in a cramped apartment in Detroit. He remembered his mother standing behind him, her hands gentle on his shoulders, telling him that music was a gift and that he had been blessed with more of that gift than anyone she had ever known. "Play for me, baby," she used to say. "Play for me and show the world what you have inside you." Marcus took a deep breath and let it out slowly. Then he raised his trembling hands and placed his fingers gently on the keys. The crowd leaned forward in anticipation, phones raised and ready, waiting for the embarrassing spectacle they were sure was about to unfold. But Marcus did not hear them anymore. He did not see their mocking smiles or notice their recording phones. All he could see were the keys beneath his fingers, and all he could hear was his mother's voice echoing in his memory. And all he could feel was the music that had been locked inside him for 43 years, finally fighting its way back to the surface. He closed his eyes, said a silent prayer, and began to play. The moment Marcus placed his fingers on the piano keys, the atmosphere in the ballroom shifted into something cruel and expectant, like a crowd at an ancient arena waiting for a gladiator to fall. Everyone in the room was watching him now. Hundreds of eyes fixed on the old janitor who had somehow convinced himself that he belonged on that stage, and the air was thick with barely contained laughter and second-hand embarrassment. Near the bar, a man in an expensive gray suit elbowed his friend and said loudly, "$20 says he can't even find middle C," and his friend laughed so hard that champagne nearly came out of his nose. A woman in diamonds leaned toward her husband and whispered, "This is absolutely ridiculous. Who let him up there?" And her husband just shook his head and pulled out his phone to record what he was sure would be the funniest thing he had seen all year. The mockery was everywhere, filling the room like poison gas, and Marcus could feel it pressing against him from all sides. He sat perfectly still on the piano bench with his eyes closed, his fingers resting lightly on the keys, and he tried to block out the sounds of laughter and ridicule that surrounded him. But it was hard, so very hard, because he could hear everything they were saying about him. "Look at his hands," someone said with disgust. "They're so rough and ugly. How could someone like that possibly play piano?" "This is going to be painful to watch," another voice added. "I almost feel sorry for him." "Almost, but not quite," a woman replied, and the people around her laughed as if she had said the funniest thing in the world. Marcus felt his heart sinking in his chest, and doubt began to creep into his mind like ice water flowing through his veins. What was he doing here? He asked himself. What made him think he had the right to sit at this beautiful piano in front of all these wealthy and important people? He was nobody, just an old janitor with worn-out shoes and a borrowed dream, and these people could see that truth even if he had tried to forget it. The professional pianist Richard Thornton was watching from the side of the stage with his arms crossed and a condescending smile on his face. "Someone should put the poor man out of his misery," Richard said to his assistant. "This is borderline elder abuse, letting him embarrass himself like this." His assistant nodded in agreement and added, "Maybe he'll just get up and leave once he realizes he can't actually play, save us all from the awkwardness." Patricia Wexler, the event coordinator, was already regretting her decision, to let Marcus take the stage. She could see the confused and annoyed expressions on the faces of several important donors, people who had paid thousands of dollars to attend this gala, and did not appreciate having their evening interrupted by what appeared to be a delusional custodial worker. "If this goes badly," she muttered to herself, "I'm going to have so much damage control to do." She held up her phone and started recording, thinking that at least she would have evidence that this disaster was not her idea if anyone tried to blame her later. Up on the stage, Marcus remained frozen in place, his fingers still resting on the keys without pressing down. The seconds stretched into what felt like hours, and the crowd grew restless with anticipation. "Just play something already," someone shouted from the back of the room, and a wave of laughter followed the words. "Yeah, we don't have all night," another voice added. Marcus opened his eyes and looked down at his hands, these rough and calloused hands that had spent 30 years pushing mops and scrubbing toilets, and doing all the dirty work that people like the ones in this room would never lower themselves to do. He thought about the life he had lived, the dreams he had abandoned, and the music that had died inside him when everything fell apart so many years ago. He thought about his mother, and the way she used to smile when he played for her, the tears that would fill her eyes when he performed the pieces she loved most. "You have a gift, baby," she used to tell him, "a gift from God himself, and one day the whole world is going to know your name." But the world had never learned his name, and his mother had died before any of her dreams for him could come true. And Marcus had spent the last 4 decades trying to forget that he had ever known how to make music at all. Now here he was, an old man on a stage surrounded by strangers who thought he was a joke, and he could feel the weight of all those lost years pressing down on his shoulders like a mountain. A tear slipped from the corner of his eye and rolled down his weathered cheek, and he did not bother to wipe it away. What did it matter if they saw him cry, he thought. They already thought he was pathetic anyway. The crowd was growing impatient now, the laughter dying down and being replaced by irritation and boredom. "This is ridiculous," a man near the front said loudly. "Someone get him off the stage." "What a waste of time," a woman agreed. "We came here for a charity gala, not a circus show." Patricia started walking toward the stage, ready to politely but firmly escort Marcus back to his mop bucket and try to salvage what was left of the evening. Richard Thornton was already preparing to return to the piano and continue his performance, shaking his head at the absurdity of what had just transpired. And then, just as Patricia reached the edge of the stage and opened her mouth to speak, Marcus began to play. The first note rang out clear and pure, cutting through the air like a bell tolling in a silent church, and Patricia stopped mid-step with the words dying on her lips. It was a single note, just one key pressed by one finger, but there was something in the sound of it that made everyone in the room fall suddenly and completely silent. Marcus pressed another key, and then another, and the notes began to connect like pearls on a string, forming a melody that seemed to float through the ballroom like mist rising from a morning lake. He had chosen Chopin's Ballade No. 1 in G minor, one of the most difficult and emotionally demanding pieces in the entire classical repertoire, and from the very first phrase, it was clear that something extraordinary was happening. The opening theme unfurled from beneath his fingers with a delicacy that seemed impossible for hands so worn and weathered, each note perfectly placed and perfectly weighted. The crowd that had been laughing moments ago now stood frozen in place, champagne glasses suspended in midair, conversations abandoned, faces transformed from mockery to confusion to something approaching awe. Richard Thornton's smirk disappeared from his face as if someone had wiped it away with a cloth, and his arms slowly uncrossed as he stared at the old janitor on the stage. Patricia Wexler lowered her phone and simply watched, her mouth hanging open in disbelief. And Marcus played on, his eyes closed, his body beginning to sway gently with the music, completely unaware of the transformation taking place in the room around him. Because for the first time in 43 years, Marcus Williams was not a janitor anymore. He was not invisible anymore. He was exactly what he had always been meant to be: a musician, an artist, a vessel through which something beautiful and transcendent could enter the world. And the music that poured from his fingers was about to change everything. The music that flowed from Marcus's fingers was unlike anything the guests in the ballroom had ever heard before, and within seconds, the entire atmosphere of the room transformed from mocking cruelty to stunned reverence. Each note he played seemed to carry the weight of 1,000 unspoken words, rising and falling like breath, like heartbeats, like the rhythm of life itself. And the wealthy audience that had been so ready to laugh at him now stood frozen in astonishment. The opening section of Chopin's Ballade in G minor began soft and contemplative, a melody so hauntingly beautiful that it seemed to reach directly into the souls of everyone who heard it. And Marcus played it with a tenderness that made grown men feel tears pricking at the corners of their eyes. His weathered fingers moved across the ivory keys with a grace and precision that seemed absolutely impossible, and watching him play was like watching magic happen in real time. A woman near the stage put her hand over her heart and whispered, "Oh my God," and the man standing next to her could only nod in agreement because words had suddenly become inadequate. The melody grew and evolved, building slowly like a sunrise spreading golden light across a dark landscape, and Marcus swayed gently on the bench, as if the music was moving through his body like an electric current. His eyes remained closed throughout, and his face had taken on an expression of complete peace, as if he had finally returned home after a long and painful journey through the wilderness. Richard Thornton, the professional pianist who had been so smug just minutes ago, felt his jaw drop open as he watched the old janitor play. He had performed this same piece dozens of times in concert halls around the world, had studied it for years under the greatest teachers money could buy, and yet he knew immediately that what he was witnessing was something far beyond his own abilities. This was not just technical skill, although the technique was flawless. This was something deeper, something that could not be taught in any conservatory or practiced into existence. This was the kind of playing that only came from a place of genuine suffering and genuine love, the kind that spoke directly to the human heart without needing translation. "Who is this man?" Richard whispered to himself, and his voice was filled not with condescension now but with genuine wonder. The phones that had been raised to mock Marcus were still recording, but now they captured something entirely different from what their owners had expected. Across the ballroom, people were sharing looks of disbelief with one another, silently asking if everyone else was hearing what they were hearing. A businessman who had made his fortune by being cold and calculating felt something warm spreading through his chest, and he did not quite know what to do with the unfamiliar sensation. A socialite who had not cried in 20 years felt hot tears streaming down her perfectly made-up face, and she did not even try to stop them. A young waiter who had paused in his work to listen felt goosebumps rising on his arms, and he thought to himself that this was the most beautiful thing he had ever experienced. The music continued to build, the phrases growing more complex and passionate, and Marcus's fingers flew across the keys with supernatural speed and accuracy. The notes cascaded like waterfalls, tumbled like leaves in an autumn wind, soared like birds rising into an endless sky, and through it all there was an emotional truth that cut straight through every pretension and barrier in the room. Patricia Wexler had forgotten entirely about the damage control she would need to do, had forgotten about the donors and the schedule, and all the things that had seemed so important just a few minutes ago. She stood at the edge of the stage with tears running down her cheeks, thinking about her father who had died when she was young, and how he used to play old songs on a battered guitar in their tiny apartment. She had not thought about her father in years, had buried those memories under layers of ambition and success, but somehow this music was bringing them all back to the surface. All around the ballroom, similar transformations were taking place. The music seemed to unlock doors that people had kept closed for decades, releasing emotions they had forgotten they were capable of feeling. An elderly woman near the front row was weeping openly, her body shaking with sobs, and her husband held her hand tightly because he was crying too. A young couple who had been on the verge of divorce looked at each other with new eyes, suddenly remembering why they had fallen in love in the first place. A man who had built his life on greed and selfishness felt something cracking open inside his chest, something that felt suspiciously like a conscience waking up after a long sleep. Marcus knew none of this, saw none of it, felt none of it. He was lost in the music, completely submerged in a world where nothing existed except the piano and the melody and the ghost of his mother's voice telling him to play. His fingers remembered things his mind had tried to forget, finding their way across the keys, with an instinct that 43 years of silence had not been able to destroy. The piece was reaching its first major climax now, the dynamics swelling from delicate whispers to thunderous proclamations, and Marcus threw his entire body into the music. His hands crashed down on the keys with controlled fury, pulling sounds from the instrument that seemed too big and too powerful to be coming from a single piano. The ballroom itself seemed to vibrate with the intensity of the music, and for one breathless moment, everyone in the room forgot about their wealth and their status and their carefully constructed identities. They were just human beings, standing together in the presence of something transcendent. And then, just as suddenly as it had risen, the storm of sound began to subside. The melody softened, became gentle and mournful, like a lullaby sung to a sleeping child or a prayer whispered in an empty church. Marcus played these quiet passages with the same care a lover might use when touching a beloved face, each note placed with impossible precision and infinite tenderness. The contrast was devastating, and more than one person in the audience had to sit down because their legs could no longer support them. A businessman who had never believed in anything beyond profit margins found himself thinking about God for the first time in his adult life. A woman who had spent years being cruel to others suddenly saw her own behavior with terrible clarity and felt shame flooding through her entire body. A young man who had been planning to end his own life that very night felt something changing inside him, felt a tiny spark of hope igniting in the darkness of his despair. The music was doing something to all of them, reaching past their defenses and touching something raw and real that lay beneath all the layers of pretense. And through it all, Marcus played on, his weathered face peaceful and his old hands young again, finally doing the one thing he had been born to do. As the Chopin Ballade continued to fill the grand ballroom with its haunting beauty, something extraordinary began to happen among the audience, something that went beyond mere appreciation of music and entered the territory of genuine spiritual transformation. People who had entered this gala caring only about being seen with the right crowd and drinking expensive champagne now found themselves standing in silence with tears streaming down their faces, unable to look away from the old janitor who was creating such devastating beauty on the stage. The melody had entered its most emotionally complex section, weaving between hope and despair, joy and sorrow, love and loss, and Marcus played each phrase as if he were telling the story of his entire life through sound alone. His body moved with the music now, leaning into the crescendos and pulling back during the quiet passages, completely lost in a world where nothing existed except the piano and the notes and the emotions that connected them. A woman named Elizabeth Chen, a powerful investment banker who had spent 20 years building walls around her heart, suddenly found herself thinking about her grandmother who had died when Elizabeth was 12. She remembered sitting on her grandmother's lap while the old woman hummed traditional songs, remembered the smell of jasmine tea, and the feeling of being completely and unconditionally loved. Elizabeth had not allowed herself to think about those memories in decades, had pushed them away as weakness, but now they came flooding back with such force that she had to grab the arm of a stranger next to her just to stay standing. The stranger did not mind at all because he was crying too. This man who ran a hedge fund and prided himself on never showing emotion. He was thinking about his son, a young man who had stopped speaking to him 3 years ago after a terrible argument about money and expectations. The music was making him realize how foolish he had been, how many precious moments he had wasted chasing things that did not matter while pushing away the one person who truly mattered. Across the room, a married couple in their 60s held hands for the first time in years and remembered why they had fallen in love in the first place. A young waiter who dreamed of being an artist but had given up on those dreams felt something reigniting inside him, a spark of possibility he had thought was dead forever. A politician who had built his career on empty promises felt shame washing over him like a wave, and he found himself wondering if it was too late to become the kind of man his daughter could be proud of. The music continued, building toward another emotional peak, and Marcus's fingers moved faster and more confidently, drawing sounds from the piano that seemed almost superhuman. He was playing the way he had played as a child, before tragedy had stolen everything from him, before he had learned that the world could be cruel and unforgiving. He was playing the way his mother had always believed he would play, with every ounce of his soul poured into every single note. Richard Thornton, the professional pianist, had moved closer to the stage without even realizing it, drawn forward by a force he could not resist. He had spent his entire career being praised as one of the finest pianists of his generation, had performed in the greatest concert halls in the world, had won awards and accolades that most musicians could only dream of. But watching this old janitor play, Richard felt something he had never expected to feel: humility. This man in the worn blue uniform, with his rough hands and his gray hair and his invisible life, was playing with a depth of feeling that Richard knew he had never achieved. All of Richard's technical skill, all of his training, all of his expensive education could not produce what was coming from that piano right now. Because Marcus was not just playing notes on an instrument, he was opening a vein and letting his soul bleed out through the music. He was sharing something so intimate and so raw that it felt almost improper to witness it, like accidentally walking in on someone praying. Richard felt tears on his own face and did not wipe them away. For the first time in his professional life, he understood what music was truly supposed to be. Patricia Wexler had completely abandoned her role as event coordinator and was simply standing at the edge of the stage, transfixed. She thought about all the events she had organized over the years, all the famous performers she had worked with, all the sophisticated audiences she had impressed. None of it had ever moved her the way this was moving her right now. She thought about the way she had looked at Marcus when he first approached her, the barely concealed contempt in her eyes, the cruel amusement she had felt at the idea of letting a janitor take the stage. Shame burned through her chest as she realized how wrong she had been, how quick she had been to judge someone based on their appearance and their job title. This man was an artist, perhaps one of the greatest she had ever witnessed, and she had treated him like garbage simply because he did not look the part. All around the ballroom, similar revelations were taking place. The wealthy guests who had spent their lives dividing the world into categories of worthy and unworthy were suddenly confronting the poverty of their own souls. The people who had laughed at Marcus just minutes ago now felt sick with regret, understanding for the first time how cruel they had been. The phones that had been raised to mock were now recording something completely different, capturing not humiliation but transcendence, Not failure, but triumph. The ballade was entering its final section now. A passage of breathtaking technical difficulty that built relentlessly toward an explosive climax. Marcus's fingers flew across the keys with impossible speed and precision, his whole body engaged in the act of creation, sweat beading on his forehead and tears streaming down his face. He was not thinking about the audience anymore, not thinking about his janitor's uniform or his years of invisibility or the mockery he had endured. He was simply playing, simply being exactly who he was meant to be, and the joy of that release was almost too much to bear. The final passages crashed through the ballroom like thunder, massive chords and racing arpeggios that seemed to shake the very foundations of the building. And then, with one last devastating surge of sound, the music reached its peak. Marcus's hands came down on the final chord with everything he had left, and the sound that erupted from the piano was unlike anything anyone in that room had ever heard. It hung in the air for what felt like an eternity, slowly fading into silence, and when it was finally gone, not a single person in the ballroom could breathe. Marcus sat motionless at the piano, his hands still resting on the keys, his eyes still closed, tears falling freely down his weathered face. And in that perfect silence, in that sacred moment after the music had ended, but before the world came rushing back in, something had fundamentally changed. The people in that ballroom were not the same people who had been there 15 minutes ago. And Marcus Williams, the invisible janitor who had lived in silence for 43 years, had finally been seen and heard at last. What nobody in that magnificent ballroom knew, what nobody could have possibly guessed by looking at the old janitor sitting at the piano with tears streaming down his face, was that Marcus Williams had once been one of the most celebrated child prodigies in American musical history. His story had begun 53 years earlier in a cramped two-room apartment in the poorest neighborhood of Detroit, where a young single mother named Dorothy Williams worked 3 jobs just to keep the lights on and food on the table for her only son. Dorothy had never had much in the way of material possessions, but she had a deep and abiding love for music that she passed on to her child from the moment he was born. She would sing to him every night old gospel songs and jazz standards and classical melodies she had learned from her own mother, and little Marcus would fall asleep to the sound of her beautiful voice filling their tiny home. When Marcus was 5 years old, Dorothy saved up for 6 months to buy him a small electronic keyboard from a second-hand store, a cheap plastic thing with sticky keys, and a tinny sound that was nothing like a real piano. But to Marcus, that keyboard was the most precious thing in the entire world. He began playing it every spare moment he had, teaching himself songs by ear, figuring out melodies he heard on the radio, creating his own compositions that were far too sophisticated for a child his age. Dorothy would come home exhausted from her long shifts at the diner and the laundromat and the cleaning service, and she would find her son sitting at that little keyboard with his eyes closed, completely lost in the music he was making. "You have a gift, baby," she would tell him, wrapping her arms around his small shoulders. "A gift from God himself, and one day the whole world is going to hear you play." Marcus believed her with all his heart, because his mother had never lied to him about anything. When Marcus was 7, a music teacher named Mrs. Alina Patterson came to his elementary school to give a demonstration for the students. She played a few simple pieces on the school's old upright piano, and then asked if any of the children wanted to try. Most of the kids were too shy or too intimidated to volunteer, but Marcus walked straight up to that piano and sat down on the bench without a moment's hesitation. What happened next became a legend that Mrs. Patterson would tell for the rest of her life. This skinny little boy from the projects placed his hands on the keys and began to play Beethoven's Moonlight Sonata, a piece he had heard only once on a television program and had somehow memorized completely. Mrs. Patterson stood frozen in disbelief, as the child played the entire first movement from memory, his small fingers stretching to reach notes that should have been impossible for hands that size. When he finished, there was complete silence in the room, and then Mrs. Patterson did something she had never done before in her 30 years of teaching. She started to cry. That afternoon, she drove to the Williams apartment and sat with Dorothy in the cramped living room, explaining that her son was not just talented, but genuinely extraordinary. "I've been teaching music for 3 decades," Mrs. Patterson said, her voice shaking with emotion, "and I have never seen anything like what your boy can do." She offered to give Marcus free lessons, to help him develop his gift, to do whatever it took to make sure this child reached his full potential. For the next 5 years, Marcus studied with Mrs. Patterson, and then with other teachers she connected him with, each one more prestigious than the last. He practiced for hours every day, sometimes forgetting to eat or sleep, because the music consumed him so completely. By the time he was 10, he was performing in local concerts and competitions, winning every prize and stunning every audience with his extraordinary ability. By the time he was 12, he had been accepted into a special program at the Juilliard School in New York, and the music world was buzzing about the prodigy from Detroit who played like someone 3 times his age. The highlight of Marcus's young career came on a spring evening when he was 12 years old, performing at Carnegie Hall as part of a showcase for exceptional young musicians. Dorothy had saved for months to afford the bus ticket to New York, and she sat in the audience that night with tears of joy streaming down her face as her son walked onto that legendary stage. Marcus played Chopin that night, the same ballade in G minor that he would play 43 years later at the Hartwell Grand Hotel, and when he finished the audience rose to their feet in a standing ovation that lasted nearly 5 minutes. Critics called him a once-in-a-generation talent, a future master, a boy who would surely become one of the greatest pianists the world had ever known. Dorothy held her son tight after the concert and whispered in his ear, "I always knew you were special, baby. I always knew the world would see what I see." Those were some of the happiest months of Marcus's life, filled with possibility and promise, and the certainty that his future would be bright. But happiness, as Marcus would soon learn, could be stolen away in an instant. 3 months after the Carnegie Hall performance, Dorothy and Marcus were driving home from a late-night rehearsal when a drunk driver ran a red light and slammed into their car at full speed. Dorothy was killed instantly, her body broken beyond recognition by the force of the impact. Marcus survived, but his left hand was crushed so badly that doctors had to perform multiple surgeries just to save it from amputation. When he finally woke up in the hospital, bandaged and broken and alone, the first thing he asked about was his mother. The look on the nurse's face told him everything he needed to know before she even spoke a word. Marcus screamed then, a sound of pure anguish that echoed through the hospital corridors and haunted the dreams of everyone who heard it. The boy who had played at Carnegie Hall, the prodigy who was supposed to change the world, died in that hospital room along with his mother. What emerged from those bandages weeks later was someone else entirely, a broken child with a ruined hand and an empty heart who would never touch a piano again. The doctors told him he would never play the way he used to, that the nerve damage in his left hand was too severe, that he should find other dreams to chase. But Marcus had no other dreams because music had been everything to him, and without his mother to believe in him, he had no reason to fight. He was placed in the foster care system because he had no other family, and he bounced from home to home for the next 6 years, a silent and sullen teenager who refused to talk about his past. Nobody in those foster homes knew that the quiet boy who kept to himself had once been famous, had once played for standing ovations, had once been destined for greatness. And Marcus never told them because that boy felt like a stranger to him now, a ghost from a life that no longer existed. When he turned 18, he left the foster system with nothing but the clothes on his back and a heart full of grief that had never properly healed. He drifted from city to city, taking whatever jobs he could find, trying to outrun the memories that followed him everywhere. Eventually, he ended up in Chicago, where he found work as a janitor at the Hartwell Grand Hotel. He had been there for 30 years now, invisible and forgotten, the prodigy transformed into a ghost. Until tonight, when something had finally called him back to the piano. As the final notes of the Chopin ballade faded into silence, Marcus remained completely still on the piano bench, his weathered hands resting on the keys as if he were afraid to let go. His entire body was trembling now, not from fear or exhaustion, but from the overwhelming flood of emotions that had been released during those 15 minutes of playing. He had poured 43 years of grief and loss and longing into that performance, had opened wounds that had never properly healed and let them bleed out through the music. And now, in the sacred silence that followed, he felt both completely empty and strangely full at the same time. Tears continued to stream down his face, falling onto his worn blue uniform and leaving dark spots on the fabric, but he made no move to wipe them away. He was thinking about his mother, seeing her face as clearly as if she were standing right in front of him, hearing her voice telling him that she had always known he was special. "I did it, Mama," he whispered so quietly that only he could hear. "I finally played again, just like you always wanted me to." The ballroom remained absolutely silent, hundreds of people standing frozen in place, as if they had been turned to statues by some powerful magic. Nobody wanted to be the first to break the spell. Nobody wanted to shatter this fragile and precious moment with something as ordinary as words. Even the waiters had stopped moving, their trays of champagne balanced forgotten on their hands as they stared at the old man on the stage. The professional pianist Richard Thornton stood near the side of the stage with tears running freely down his face, all trace of his earlier arrogance completely gone. He had spent his entire life believing that he understood music, that his technical training and natural ability had made him a master of his craft. But watching Marcus play had shown him how little he truly knew, how shallow his own playing had been compared to what he had just witnessed. This janitor, this invisible old man in his worn uniform, had achieved something that Richard had been chasing his entire career without ever quite catching it. He had played with complete authenticity, with no barrier between his heart and the music, with nothing held back or protected. Richard made a silent vow to himself in that moment that he would never play the same way again, that he would spend the rest of his career trying to find even a fraction of the truth he had heard tonight. Patricia Wexler stood at the edge of the stage with her hand pressed over her mouth, her perfectly applied makeup ruined by the tears that had been flowing for the past 10 minutes. She was thinking about all the times she had walked past Marcus in the hallways of the hotel without ever acknowledging his existence, all the times she had looked through him as if he were not even there. How many other people had she dismissed and ignored because they did not fit her idea of what success looked like? She wondered. How many extraordinary souls had she passed by without ever seeing them because she was too busy judging people by their clothes and their job titles and their bank accounts? The shame of that realization was almost unbearable, but Patricia did not look away from it. She let it wash over her, let it change her, let it burn away some of the coldness that had built up around her heart over the years. In the audience, similar transformations were taking place in dozens of hearts. A hedge fund manager named David was thinking about his estranged son and wondering if it was too late to pick up the phone and say the words he should have said years ago. A society woman named Margaret was remembering her own mother, who had died alone in a nursing home, while Margaret was too busy with her social calendar to visit. A young tech entrepreneur named Jason was questioning for the first time whether the fortune he was building, was worth the relationships he had sacrificed to build it. The music had cracked something open in all of them, had exposed the soft and vulnerable places they usually kept hidden beneath layers of wealth and status and carefully constructed personas. And now, in this moment of raw collective emotion, they were all just human beings confronting the truth of their own lives. Marcus finally opened his eyes and looked up at the crowd for the first time since he had started playing. He expected to see mockery and contempt, the same expressions he had seen before the music began. Instead, he saw hundreds of faces wet with tears, hundreds of eyes looking at him with something that looked like reverence. He did not understand what had happened, did not realize the magnitude of what he had done. He was just an old man who had played a piece of music he used to know, just a janitor who had borrowed a piano for a few minutes. But as he looked out at those transformed faces, he began to sense that something profound had occurred. The silence stretched on, growing deeper and more powerful with each passing second. Nobody wanted to break it. Nobody wanted to be the first to return to the ordinary world after experiencing something so extraordinary. Marcus sat there on the bench, uncertain what to do next, feeling exposed and vulnerable in a way he had not felt in decades. He thought about standing up and walking back to his mop bucket, about returning to his invisible life as if nothing had happened. But before he could move, something began to happen in the audience. An elderly woman near the front of the crowd, a woman with silver hair and expensive jewelry and tears streaming down her lined face, slowly raised her hands and began to clap. The sound of her applause rang out sharp and clear in the silence, and for a moment she was the only one clapping. But then the man next to her joined in, and then the woman behind them, and then suddenly the entire ballroom erupted into thunderous applause that shook the crystal chandeliers and rattled the champagne glasses. People were cheering and crying and stamping their feet, releasing all the emotion that had built up during the performance in one massive wave of sound. The applause went on, growing louder rather than fading, and then people began to stand up from their seats and tables. One by one, then in groups, then all at once, the entire audience rose to their feet in a standing ovation for the old janitor who had just given them the most meaningful musical experience of their lives. Marcus sat on the piano bench, completely overwhelmed, unable to process what was happening. These were the same people who had laughed at him, who had mocked him, who had recorded him on their phones expecting a humiliating failure. And now they were standing and cheering and crying for him as if he were the greatest pianist in the world. He thought of his mother and how proud she would be if she could see this moment. He thought of the 12-year-old boy who had played at Carnegie Hall and believed that his dreams would come true. He thought of all the years of silence and invisibility, all the decades of grief and lost potential. And for the first time since the night his mother died, Marcus Williams allowed himself to believe that maybe his life had not been wasted after all. Maybe everything he had been through, all the pain and loss and loneliness, had been leading him to this moment. Maybe his mother had been right all along when she told him that the world would one day hear him play. The applause continued to thunder through the ballroom as Marcus slowly rose from the piano bench. His legs were unsteady, and his hands were still trembling, but there was a light in his eyes that had not been there in 43 years. He bowed his head slightly in acknowledgement of the ovation, a humble gesture from a humble man who still could not quite believe what was happening. And the crowd cheered even louder, giving him the recognition and love that he had been denied for most of his adult life. The standing ovation continued for what felt like an eternity, wave after wave of applause crashing over Marcus like water breaking against a shore. He stood there beside the piano, this old man in his janitor's uniform, and he received the adoration of hundreds of wealthy strangers who had tried to humiliate him just minutes before. The sound was deafening, overwhelming, almost too much to bear. But beneath all that noise, there was something even more powerful happening. In the spaces between the claps, in the brief pauses when people drew breath to cheer again, there was a silence that spoke louder than any applause ever could. It was the silence of hearts being changed, of minds being opened, of assumptions being shattered into a million pieces. It was the silence of rich people realizing that they had almost missed something extraordinary because of their own prejudice and arrogance. It was the silence of human beings confronting the smallness of their own souls and finding the courage to grow larger. Richard Thornton was the first person from the stage area to approach Marcus, walking toward him with slow, deliberate steps, as if approaching something sacred. When he reached the old janitor, he did not offer a handshake or a formal congratulation. Instead, he bowed deeply from the waist, a gesture of genuine respect and humility that shocked everyone who witnessed it. "That was the most beautiful thing I have ever heard in my life," Richard said when he straightened up, his voice cracking with emotion. "And I have been a fool to think that I understood anything about music until tonight." Marcus looked at him with surprise, not sure how to respond to such praise from a professional musician. "I just played a piece I used to know," he said quietly, "nothing special about it." Richard shook his head and placed a hand on Marcus's shoulder. "No," he said firmly. "What you did up there was not just playing, it was speaking directly to the human soul, and I will spend the rest of my career trying to learn how to do what you just did." The crowd was beginning to surge forward now, people pushing toward the stage to get closer to Marcus, to touch him, to thank him, to tell him how his music had affected them. An elderly woman with silver hair and expensive diamonds reached him first, grasping both of his rough hands in her soft, manicured ones. "Young man," she said, even though Marcus was clearly not young anymore, "I lost my husband 6 months ago, and I have been frozen inside ever since, unable to cry, unable to feel anything at all, but your music unlocked something in me tonight, and I wept for the first time since he died." Marcus did not know what to say, so he simply held her hands and nodded. "Thank you," the woman continued, tears still glistening on her wrinkled cheeks. "Thank you for giving me back my grief, because grief means that I loved him, and I had forgotten how to feel that love." Before Marcus could respond, another person had taken her place, a middle-aged businessman with red-rimmed eyes and an expensive watch. "I called my son," the man said, holding up his phone as if to prove it. "I stepped outside during your performance and I called my son, who I haven't spoken to in 3 years, and we talked, really talked, for the first time in so long." He grabbed Marcus's hand and shook it vigorously. "I don't know what happened when you played," he continued, "but something in your music made me realize that I was wasting what little time I have left, and I couldn't wait another minute to try to fix things with my boy." The crowd kept coming, each person with their own story of how Marcus's performance had touched them. A young woman said that she had been planning to end her marriage, but now she wanted to try again. A doctor confessed that he had lost his passion for helping people, but now felt it returning. A teenager admitted that she had been considering dropping out of school, but now believed she should keep trying. A retired teacher said that hearing Marcus play reminded her of why she had chosen her profession in the first place. Story after story, confession after confession, transformation after transformation. Marcus listened to all of them with growing wonder, unable to believe that his music could have had such a profound effect on so many people. He was just a janitor, he kept thinking, just an old man who had been invisible for most of his life. How could 15 minutes at a piano change anything for anyone? But the evidence was standing right in front of him. Dozens of wealthy, powerful people with tears on their faces telling him that he had changed something inside them. Patricia Wexler finally made her way through the crowd to stand before Marcus, her face stripped of its usual professional mask. "I owe you an apology," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I looked at you tonight and I saw only your uniform, only your job, only the surface of who you are." She paused and took a shaky breath. "I have been doing that my whole life," she continued, "judging people by what they look like instead of who they really are, and I am ashamed of myself." Marcus looked at this woman who had dismissed him so casually just half an hour ago, and he felt no anger toward her. He understood better than anyone how easy it was to become invisible, how simple it was for the world to look right through you. "We all have things we're ashamed of," he said gently. "The question is what we do now." Patricia nodded, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. "I want to know your story," she said. "The real story, not just what happened tonight, but everything that came before." Marcus felt something tighten in his chest at her words. Nobody had asked about his story in 43 years. Nobody had cared enough to wonder who he really was, or where he had come from. But looking at Patricia's face, looking at all the faces gathered around him, he realized that maybe the time had finally come to stop hiding. Maybe his mother had been right all along, when she said the world would hear him play. And maybe, just maybe, this was not an ending at all. Maybe this was the beginning of something new, a second chance that Marcus had never expected and had certainly never believed he deserved. The crowd eventually began to thin as the gala resumed, and people returned to their tables. But something had fundamentally changed in that ballroom, something that could never be undone. Every person who had witnessed Marcus's performance would carry it with them for the rest of their lives. And Marcus himself, the invisible janitor who had lived in silence for so many years, would never be invisible again. When Marcus woke up the next morning in his small apartment on the south side of Chicago, he half believed that the previous night had been nothing more than a vivid dream. He lay in his narrow bed staring at the water-stained ceiling and replayed the events in his mind. The piano calling to him, the mocking laughter, the music flowing through his fingers, the standing ovation. It seemed impossible that any of it had really happened, that he had actually sat down at that beautiful Steinway and played for the first time in over 4 decades. But then his phone began to ring, and it did not stop ringing for the rest of the day. The first call came from the hotel manager, a man named Robert Chen, who had never spoken directly to Marcus in all the years he had worked there. Robert's voice was excited and breathless as he explained that videos of Marcus's performance had been posted online overnight and were spreading across social media like wildfire. "You're famous," Robert said, the disbelief evident in his voice. "There are news vans parked outside the hotel right now wanting to interview the janitor who played the piano." Marcus could not process what he was hearing. Famous was a word that belonged to his childhood, to the boy who had played at Carnegie Hall, not to the invisible old man he had become. But the calls kept coming, more and more of them, from journalists and television producers and radio hosts who all wanted to talk to him. By noon, the video of his performance had been viewed over 5 million times and was climbing higher with every passing hour. Comments poured in from around the world, thousands and then hundreds of thousands of people sharing their reactions to what they had witnessed. "I'm crying at my desk at work," one comment read. "This is the most beautiful thing I've ever seen." "Who is this man?" another asked. "How is it possible that someone so talented has been working as a janitor?" "This gives me hope that there is still magic in the world," a third wrote. By the end of the first day, investigative journalists had begun digging into Marcus's past, and by the second day, the full story had emerged. Headlines exploded across news sites and social media platforms around the world. Child prodigy lost to tragedy returns after 43 years, and the janitor who once played Carnegie Hall, and a mother's dream finally comes true. The story of young Marcus Whitmore, the boy wonder from Detroit who had played for standing ovations before having everything stolen away by a drunk driver, captured the imagination of millions. People wept as they read about Dorothy Williams, the single mother who had worked 3 jobs to nurture her son's extraordinary gift. They raged at the injustice of a system that had let a genius slip through the cracks, that had allowed someone with such incredible talent to spend 43 years pushing a mop. And they celebrated the triumph of his return. This moment of redemption that seemed to prove that it was never too late for dreams to come true. By the end of the first week, the video had been viewed over 50 million times, and Marcus had become a genuine phenomenon. GoFundMe campaigns raised hundreds of thousands of dollars in his name, though Marcus kept insisting that he did not need or want the money. The Juilliard School, the same institution that had accepted him as a 12-year-old prodigy, reached out with an offer to teach master classes to their most advanced students. Famous pianists from around the world sent messages of admiration and respect, calling his performance one of the most moving they had ever witnessed. A renowned concert hall in New York invited him to perform a full recital, promising him the stage at Lincoln Center for an entire evening. Through it all, Marcus remained quiet and humble, seemingly bewildered by the attention that had suddenly descended upon his life. He continued going to work at the hotel each day, though now everyone stopped to talk to him instead of looking through him. He gave interviews when asked, but kept his answers simple and sincere, never seeking to dramatize his story or present himself as anything other than what he was. "I'm just a man who used to play piano," he would say when reporters pressed him about his remarkable talent, "and then one night I played again, that's all." When asked why he had finally decided to play after so many decades of silence, Marcus always gave the same answer. "I think my mother told me it was time," he would say, his eyes growing misty. "I could feel her with me that night, pushing me toward the piano, telling me not to be afraid." The media loved that response, and it became one of the most quoted lines from any interview he gave. But for Marcus, it was not a clever sound bite or a way to generate sympathy. It was simply the truth as he understood it. He had felt Dorothy's presence that night at the gala, had heard her voice whispering encouragement in his ear, had sensed her spirit guiding his fingers across the keys. Whether that was real or imagined, Marcus did not know and did not particularly care. What mattered was that he had played, and in playing he had found his way back to himself. The weeks that followed brought more opportunities than Marcus could have imagined in his wildest dreams. Richard Thornton, the professional pianist who had been so humbled by Marcus's performance, offered to collaborate with him on a series of concerts. A documentary filmmaker began working on a feature-length film about his life, interviewing the few people who had known him during his prodigy years. A publisher approached him about writing a memoir, promising a substantial advance for the story of his remarkable journey. Marcus said yes to some of these offers and no to others, always following his instincts about what felt right and what felt like too much. He did not want to become a celebrity or a brand or a symbol of anything. He just wanted to play music and maybe, if he was very lucky, help other people find their way back to their own buried dreams. One afternoon, about a month after the gala, Marcus received a letter that made him sit down and cry for nearly an hour. It was from a woman named Eleanor Patterson Johnson, now 91 years old and living in a retirement community in Florida. She was the same Mrs. Patterson who had discovered him in that elementary school classroom 53 years ago, the teacher who had recognized his gift and changed the course of his life. "My dear Marcus," the letter began, "I have waited 43 years to hear you play again, and I never gave up hope that someday you would find your way back to the music." She went on to describe how she had followed the news about him over the decades, always wondering what had become of the extraordinary boy she had once taught. "Your mother would be so proud of you," the letter concluded, "and so am I, more proud than words can express." Marcus read that letter over and over again, holding it carefully so his tears would not smudge the shaky handwriting. And he made a silent promise to his old teacher, to his mother, and to himself. He would not let this second chance slip away. He would play again, not for fame or money or applause, but for the simple reason that music was who he was and had always been. The world had finally remembered Marcus Williams, and this time he was determined to make sure they would never forget. 6 months had passed since the night that changed everything, and Marcus Williams stood backstage at the Hartwell Grand Hotel, preparing to perform at the same annual charity gala where his journey had begun. But everything was different now, so completely and utterly different that Marcus sometimes had to pinch himself to make sure he was not dreaming. Instead of his worn blue janitor's uniform, he wore a tailored black suit that had been custom-made to fit his lean frame. Instead of a mop bucket waiting for him in the corner, there was a dressing room with his name on the door and fresh flowers on the table. Instead of being invisible to everyone around him, he was the guest of honor, the headlining performer, the reason why hundreds of people had paid thousands of dollars each to attend tonight's event. The transformation still did not feel entirely real to him, even after all these months of interviews and offers and attention. He was the same person he had always been, the same Marcus who had spent 43 years cleaning up after people who never noticed him. But the world saw him differently now, and that had changed everything. There was a knock at his dressing room door, and Patricia Wexler entered, looking nervous and humble in a way that would have been unthinkable 6 months ago. She was still the event coordinator for the hotel, but her relationship with Marcus had changed completely since that night. She had become something like a friend to him, one of the few people who had witnessed his transformation from the very beginning. "The ballroom is completely full," she said, her voice filled with wonder. "There's not an empty seat in the house, and I've had to turn away at least 50 people who showed up hopping to get in." Marcus nodded slowly, still not quite able to believe that people would pay so much money just to hear him play. "Are you nervous?" Patricia asked, studying his face with genuine concern. Marcus thought about the question for a moment before answering. "Not nervous exactly," he said. "More like grateful. I keep thinking about all the years I spent being invisible, all the music that was locked up inside me with nowhere to go, and now I get to share it with people who actually want to hear it." Patricia's eyes grew moist at his words. "You know," she said quietly, "I've thought a lot about that night, about the way I treated you when you first asked to play, and I'm still ashamed of how dismissive I was." Marcus shook his head gently. "Don't be," he said. "You gave me a chance when you could have said no, and that's what matters." "But I gave you that chance for the wrong reasons," Patricia insisted. "I thought you would embarrass yourself and it would be entertaining. I had no idea you were going to do what you did." "Nobody did," Marcus replied with a slight smile, "including me." He walked over to the corner of the dressing room where a worn blue janitor's uniform hung on a hook, the same uniform he had been wearing that night 6 months ago. He had asked the hotel if he could keep it, and they had agreed without question. "I keep this here to remind me," he said, running his fingers over the faded fabric, "to remind me of who I was and where I came from, so I never forget that success doesn't make a person valuable. They were valuable all along." Patricia wiped her eyes and nodded. "The world needs more people who think like you do," she said softly. A few minutes later, Marcus stood in the wings of the stage, listening to the murmur of the crowd and the soft music playing over the speakers. The ballroom looked exactly as it had 6 months ago, the same crystal chandeliers and marble floors and elegant decorations. But there was one crucial difference that Marcus could feel even before he walked out onto the stage. This time, nobody was waiting to laugh at him. This time, everyone in that room knew exactly who he was and what he could do. This time, they had come specifically to hear him play. The announcer's voice boomed through the speakers, introducing him with a list of accomplishments and accolades that still sounded strange to his ears. And then it was time. Marcus walked onto the stage to thunderous applause, hundreds of people rising to their feet before he had even played a single note. He saw faces in the crowd that he recognized. The hedge fund manager who had called his estranged son, the elderly woman who had finally been able to grieve for her husband, the young waiter who had quit his job to pursue his dream of becoming an artist. They were all there, these people whose lives had intersected with his on that magical night, and they had come to witness his triumph. Marcus reached the piano, the same beautiful Steinway that had called to him across the room all those months ago, and he paused to run his fingers gently across its polished surface. He thought about his mother, about the sacrifices she had made, about the faith she had never lost in his abilities even when he had lost faith in himself. "This is for you, Mama," he whispered, so quietly that only he could hear. Then he sat down on the bench, placed his hands on the keys, and began to play. The music that filled the ballroom that night was different from what he had played 6 months before. It was not the desperate outpouring of 4 decades of suppressed emotion, not the raw bleeding of a wounded soul finally finding its voice. Instead, it was something calmer, something more assured, something that spoke of peace and acceptance and the quiet joy of a man who had finally found his way home. Marcus played for nearly 2 hours, piece after piece flowing from his fingers with effortless grace. He played Chopin and Beethoven and Debussy, the classical masters he had studied as a child. He played jazz standards and old gospel songs, the music his mother had sung to him in their cramped apartment in Detroit. He played an original composition he had written during the past 6 months, a piece called Dorothy's Dream that told the story of a mother's love and a son's long journey back to himself. And when he finally played the last note and lifted his hands from the keys, the silence that followed was not the stunned disbelief of 6 months ago. It was the reverent appreciation of an audience that had just witnessed something sacred. The applause that erupted was even louder than before, even longer, even more filled with genuine emotion. But this time Marcus did not feel overwhelmed or confused. He stood up from the piano bench and bowed deeply, accepting the love that was being offered to him, understanding at last that he deserved it. He thought about the 58 years of his life, the soaring highs and the crushing lows, the dreams achieved and the dreams deferred. He thought about the boy who had played at Carnegie Hall and the man who had pushed a mop for 30 years. He thought about loss and grief and resilience, about the mysterious ways that life could break you down and build you back up again. And he thought about his mother, her beautiful face smiling down at him from somewhere beyond the stars. "I did it, Mama," he said silently, his heart overflowing with gratitude. "I finally did it." The crowd continued to cheer as Marcus stood on that stage, no longer a janitor, no longer invisible, no longer defined by tragedy and lost potential. He was simply Marcus Williams, a man who had found his way back to the music. And that was more than enough. That was everything.